Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video. I'm smiling because this is the fourth time I try to do that introduction and I keep saying the wrong video because my brain is like mush. Ukraine Update video giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Let's go first to, it's a bit of a smorgasbord, bit of a random assortment of topics today, no particular connection between the topics. We're going to go first to this thread concerning some images of a Russian plane and what it's armed with. So, stills from a newly published Russian MOD clip showing a pair of VKS, that's Russian Air Force Su-34s, departing Belbek Air Base in Crimea on a suppression of enemy air defense patrol. Lead aircraft is seen equipped with a single KH-31P PKARM Station 12, as well as L265VI and L265VP wingtip ECM pods. Okay, what I'm saying there doesn't particularly, it's not hugely important what those things are. So he then replied to himself in this way to explain. So, since someone asked why Su-34s are typically shown carrying just one ARM, so these are anti-radiation missiles. They are missiles to find air defense systems where the radar is emitting, and then you hit the air defense system and blow it up. So they are carrying just one ARM each. Su-34 seed patrols, suppression of enemy air defense patrols, are largely meant to deter Ukrainian surface-to-air missile operators from emitting. They are conducted in a risk-averse manner. The Su-34s appear to operate well inside Russian-controlled airspace and rarely, if at all, enter the engagement zones of Ukrainian SAM systems in order to attempt to entice their operators into activating their radars so as to then attack them with ARMs. Hence, Su-34s seemingly oftentimes do not launch ARMs on such patrols, especially given that the rules of engagement apparently typically require them to first report a detected emitter to a command post and then wait for authorization to launch an ARM against it. This is done to reduce the likelihood of fratricide, so killing their own, but also increases the chances that Ukrainian SAM operators, who generally maintain strict emissions control, radiating only for brief periods of time, will cease emitting before the Su-34s are able to launch an ARM. In other words, what he's saying here is they only carry a couple of missiles because they don't really need to use many missiles. In fact, they rarely use those missiles at all. Sending up those aircraft with those ARMs on board is a deterrence to get the Ukrainians to turn off their air defense systems so that missiles can then come over, or so that aircraft can do other types of sorties, so on and so forth. So I think that's an interesting insight into the usage of airframes in order, in order to deter rather than to attack. So that is that. We'll move on. In fact, we'll keep on the air defense, or we'll talk about air defense systems here. So there's a bit of a connection. And I don't want to bore you with sort of Patriot stuff again. There's been an awful lot of talk about Patriot. I've been talking about it a lot. But I think this is a really important thread, and you may disagree or agree with parts of it. Question was asked to me the other day. What do you think in terms of the Ukrainian claims of taking, say, for example, 100% of missiles down of a sort of a saturation barrage? So the Russians will send a bunch of missiles and drones over, and Ukrainians might say we've taken down 100%, like they did 2 nights ago, 18 out of 18 missiles. Or other times, they might take 90%, 86, or whatever. Are they accurate? And the first thing to say is always be healthily skeptical. Both sides will be over egging their achievements. That is just the nature of warfare. It's the nature, that's human nature. They will want to be communicating stuff to the enemy. They want to be communicating stuff to their own troops. They want to be communicating stuff to their own domestic audience and communicating stuff to the international audience. So there'll be lots of agendas going on there, lots of motivations to say different things. What I will say is that in terms of Ukraine, something that applies to Ukraine that doesn't apply to Russia is that if Russia lies, they don't care what the rest of the world think. And this is actually really important. What they care about is what their domestic audience think, because they're not getting any weaponry supplied by the rest of the world. They're not kind of trying to ingratiate themselves with other nations so that other nations give them weaponry. There are strict sanctions in place, and they are kind of a pariah state. What is important for the Kremlin, what is important for Putin, is that his domestic audience are fully on board and think exactly what he wants them to think. And so, therefore, lying, it, it doesn't matter if we can, in the open source intelligence community, can debunk loads of the claims, like the TASS claims, the news agency, the MOD claims are ridiculous. 400 and whatever aircraft shot down, so the Russians claim, and the Ukrainians only started the war with 124. I mean, it's obviously BS. It's just complete nonsense. So we can sit there and say that, but it's water off a duck's back for the Kremlin, for the MOD, because actually they don't give a toss what we think. They care about what the domestic audience think. And if their domestic audience thinks, hey, we're doing awesomely in the war, and they have no easy way of checking that, and in fact, if you do check that and say that's BS, then you get put in prison, it's a whole different kettle of fish. So the Russians can lie and get away with it, and it does a job for them in supporting a narrative which then keeps their population, their domestic population in, you know, in place. It keeps them thinking what they want them to think, and there can be no dissent. Fab. So they will lie. If the Ukrainians lie and then they come up with complete BS claims, then in the open source community we'll just call them out for that, and then they will be found to be less trustworthy, and then the international audience will find the Ukrainians to be less trustworthy, and then there'll be a lack of trust, and thus a lack of aid or lack of desire to aid an untrustworthy entity. So I think, and also their domestic audience have access to the internet and access to fact checking in a way that the Russian audience arguably do not have. Certainly, it's much easier for the Ukrainians to freely access the internet without having to have VPNs, without having to wonder whether the FSB is going to knock on the door. Now, there have been tighter regulations with regard to sharing imagery and whatnot that's taken place in the last few weeks. They've tightened those laws so that there's no live feeds allowed to be shown. This came out of the Patriot air defense system being damaged the other day. There were live feeds being shown. That people have been done for that. There have been images shown, and people have been done for that. So there is a little bit of constraint around what people do on the internet, but broadly speaking, I mean, that's kind of understandable, because what they don't want is information feeding back to Russia. That's their main worry there. I don't think the Russians have the capability to adapt missile trajectories in real time in light of information coming from live feeds. I don't think they're that good. But anyway, that's by the by. Ukrainians have a much different situation with regard to information, and a very different relationship with their governments and with their armed forces than the Russians do with theirs. And international players have a very different relationship with Ukraine than they do with Russia. And so it is in the best interest for Ukraine to be as accurate as possible, whilst also getting away probably with a little bit of propaganda. So with their general staff figures released every day, they're going to be erring on the side of making them look better. Like, we're going to guess how many people died in there, rather than say, oh, I think only 5. They'll be like, well, it could have been 15, so we're going to go for the 15 type thing. I think there's going to be more of that kind of activity going on. So I think the figures will be inflated, but not so purposefully as we see with the Russians, so that it's just inflated to the point of being ridiculous. So do we trust the Ukrainians when they say 100% of missiles have been shot down? I say it could be true, but it could just as easily not be true, and we just need to understand that when we listen to those figures. The Dr. Jeffrey Lewis gets involved with a bit of an argument to do with what happened about what happened concerning the claims involving the Patriot damage the other day. He's a professor, International Security Advisory Board, etc., etc. He knows his stuff. Right. There are 3 separate issues here. So this came from, he got dragged in. So this was to do with, I remember this arms control wonk piece from 2018. So this is Shashank Joshi referring to your man here. He quotes him saying, "I'm deeply skeptical that Patriot has ever intercepted a long-range ballistic missile in combat." So this is the idea that can Patriot really shoot down Kinjal? Can it really take out these ballistic missiles? Of course, I've talked to you about whether the claims of the ballistic missiles are overhyped. It's a hypersonic missile, but does it do what the Russians claim it does? Probably not. Uh, are the is the US upgrading Patriot continuously? Yes, they're trying to make it as good as possible, and all this will feed back into their kind of knowledge base as well. But Dr. Jeffrey Lewis says there are three separate issues here. One, do we take the Ukrainian claim to be have downed 18 targets at face value? Two, is it likely? And three, does Pac 3 make a meaningful contribution to the defense of Ukraine? My answers are no, not likely, and still maybe. So he's not as he's not as positive about the claims about what happened as many other pro-Ukrainians might be. So, do we take Ukrainian claims to have intercepted 6 X-47 M2 Kinzhal aero ballistic missiles, 9 caliber cruise missiles from ships in the Black Sea, and 3 land-based missiles S-400 Iskander M at face value? Oh, come on, he says. So he's definitely not taking that at face value. During the 1991 Gulf War, the US said it intercepted 45 of 47 Scuds fired by Iraq. It later turned out that the number was much, much lower than that, and he gives the details of that from a foreign policy piece. What must be remembered here for me to counter back with him, that's a long time ago, and technology really has improved, and the PAC-3 generation of Patriots is arguably a different kettle of fish, but it also hasn't been tested in a combat environment like this. So it's possibly, apples and oranges here, or apples and bricks, comparing two things that are possibly, it's a bit of a false comparison. As an aside or point of clarification, the assessment by CRS is a very different argument than Ted Postel's analysis of video evidence, which GAO, CRS staff, and others believe was seriously flawed. I think it is flawed too. So this is talking about, I presume, the video analysis from the other night, but I could be wrong. That's why my colleagues at James Martin CNS were skeptical of Saudi claims that Patriot was intercepting all the Iranian missiles being fired from Yemen. We were only able to examine two cases closely, but in both we concluded that there was no intercept. Now, let me be clear. The Ukrainians should absolutely be claiming that they shot down all the Russian targets. This is a war, not an academic conference. There is no reason for Ukrainian officials to do Putin's BDA for him. On a second point, it is likely that the Patriot went 18 for 18. I mean, is that likely? Let's give Patriot its due. The Patriot system in Ukraine is the PAC-3, which is a very different, vastly improved system, that's what I was saying, than the older systems that share the brand name Patriot. PAC-3 has some capability against medium-range ballistic missiles with a burnout velocity of 3.5 kilometers per second, which is the high-end estimates of the Kinzhal. So an intercept is definitely possible. On the other hand, Shohei Ohtani is a great batter, but he's never gone 18 for 18. A few considerations. First, per the New York Times, quote, 2 US officials confirmed that the Patriot system had been damaged in the attack, but added that the Patriot remained operational against all threats. That might not have been a Russian missile, though. While there was definitely a flash in one of the videos showing an explosion near the battery, that could either have been a Russian missile getting through, or as we saw in Saudi, an interceptor failing. And this is what I talked about this morning in my news piece. Another point, Shoigu claimed that 18 was 3 times greater than the number Russia launched. That's interesting. So while he's not reliable, we've seen plenty of interceptors launched against phantom radar attacks. It's very plausible the number was less than 18. Another problem in 1991 was Iraqi missiles either broke up in flight or badly missed their targets, which resulted in overestimating the success of Patriot. Russian missiles have low reliability rates. So that's a further complication, but in a good way. So in other words, there could be like phantom missiles, the ones that pop up on radar, or decoys, or ones that are just really bad and miss their targets and blow up themselves. And then you can say, well, Patriot took that and that's 100% Patriot success. Well, actually, it might be like 80% Patriot success and 20% shite missiles. So there is some elbow room in these kind of claims. Another aside, the Ukrainians were quite clear that Russia used the S-300 missile in surface-to-surface mode, which is something we knew it could do in theory, but I haven't seen in practice. The S-300 is Russian missile defense interceptor. Going 18 for 18 seems unlikely, but not impossible. What's more likely is that the Ukrainians launched against 18 targets, and PAC-3 reported that the interceptor had successfully engaged the target. That doesn't mean it killed the target or that it was even there. Does this matter? Not really. The case for investing in PAC-3 will be statistical, not anecdotal. PAC-3 doesn't have to succeed 100% of the time to be a cost-effective addition to Ukraine's capabilities. I think this is basically right. I don't know what the actual cost exchange ratio is likely to be, but it's plausible that the cost of destroying the individual elements in a Patriot battery is a bad trade for Russia. PAC-3 isn't that expensive. So what he's saying here is, like, if Russia are going to try and take out a whole battery, a whole Patriot battery, where you've got maybe 8 launchers and all these other bits of kit, and you think, right, they need to get enough missiles through the whole Kyiv air defense systems and network, the IADs, in order to take out that old battery, that's going to cost them a phenomenal amount of money in high-end missiles to do that. And in fact, it's just not worth them doing it. So that cost exchange ratio is just doesn't work in Russia's favor. Now they're going to, be cock a hoop about how wonderful they are in damaging this Patriot, but it is more likely the Patriot was damaged by one of its own interceptor missiles or fallout from the sky, rather than an actual successful missile strike from the Russians. But is it going to be worth them continuing this approach? No, I was saying this morning that realistically they should probably stay away from Kyiv now and concentrate on other places. Think about sending Kinzhals and cruise missiles against positions of counteroffensive equipment and whatnot in the Zaporizhia area, or against Odessa, or against here and there, rather than waste them against Kyiv. Basically, you'd have to figure out how many Kinzhal missiles at what cost it would take to destroy each element in the battery, accounting for the cost of the vehicle plus missiles expended in defending itself. It's not obvious to me that that's a good trade for Russia. Agreed. There are other factors to consider. If Patriot becomes a Russian missile magnet, then in a resource-constrained world, those missiles Russia spends trying to kill Patriot aren't targeting Ukrainian military forces or civilian infrastructure. That's good. Yes, this is what I said yesterday in my piece on the Kinzhal and on the Patriot system. I think in one of my videos, anyway. So exactly this. It's brilliant that the Patriot is attracting all this attention from Russia, because those missiles aren't hitting other things. So yeah, be a magnet, take out the Patriot system for sure, because you're not destroying actual bona fide targets. And that's good for Ukraine. And of course, the batteries defend targets other than themselves. That's also good. All of which is to say, Patriot doesn't need to be perfect in this scenario to offer a cost-effective strategy to deal with Russia's heavy use of long-range missile strikes. Update: I ran a bunch of numbers, and PAC-3 doesn't have to be that effective to be cost-effective. I made a ton of assumptions where data would have been better. Kinzhal circle error probable, so we don't really know how accurate a Kinzhal is in terms of what'll hit. So just to remind you, circle error probable. If you've got a CEP of, say, I don't know, 100 meters, it means that 50% of the time, say you send 10 missiles, 5 of them have to hit within 100 meters of the target. It doesn't mean 5 of them hit the target. It means 5 of them hit within, if your CEP is 100 meters, within 100 meters of that target. The other 5 can literally go anywhere else in the world. That's how inaccurate something can be for it to still be called a precision-guided munition, and for it to still be classed as being precise. Of course, if your CEP is smaller, so say it's a 5-meter CEP, then like HIMARS have got a much lower CEP, so they will hit 50% of the time within whatever, I don't know, 5 meters, whatever it is, of their target. And of course, if you're hitting 5 meters away from your target, you're still going to be damaging that target quite a lot. So it depends what the CEP actually is, and no one knows, I don't think, what the CEP for the Kinjal is, what its payload lethality, system reliability, and cost set against PAC-3, because there's no transparency with these. The Russians don't produce the data. Set against PAC-3 vehicle hardness and intercept rate. But that looks like a very expensive trade for Russia, even with pretty generous assumptions. And I said this, and someone tried to call me out, pro-Russian voice tried to call me out, and I think I put them straight, which is that we can make some pretty good guesses at what the cost of a Kinjal is going to be. And I think $10 million is a very low estimate. It's going to cost much more than that. And if that's how you're costing Kinjals, then if you're going to be sending barrages of those, saturation attacks of Kinjals at these installations to try and take them out, then that's a very expensive way of trying to do your warfare, and that money's better spent elsewhere, one would claim. Right. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting thread. Tell me if you disagree or agree with what he's saying. Okay, Mick Ryan, another Mick Ryan thread. We love a bit of Mick Ryan, retired Australian general. Recently, the pending Ukrainian offences have received a lot of attention. However, we should also understand how these offences, and most likely to follow in the future, comprise one part of a larger view of victory for Ukraine. Victory is a central concept in our understanding of war. Sun Tzu, writing in On War, described victory as a main object in war, writing that a skilled commander seeks victory from the situation and does not demand it from his subordinates. If you think about what Putin was doing, is I want Bakhmut to be taken by the 9th of May or whatever, or by the end of March originally, all these different claims. Let's assume that they're true. I mean, that's ridiculous, putting a time scale on something that when you're not ready to commit to that kind of objective anyway, and say, I want that by this day. It's just, well, you're just setting yourself up for failure. In a May 1940 speech, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill asked, what is our aim? Victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival. Victory can be hard to define. Chana Driscoll writes in Victory, the Triumph and Tragedy of Just War, it quotes, it can be hard to pin down exactly what victory means in practical terms. Although we know it stands for winning, what this means in practice is anyone's guess. Basil Liddell Hart, writing in the US Naval War College Review in 1952, described how the object in war is a quote, the object in war is a better state of peace, even if only from your own point of view. Hence, it is essential to conduct war with constant regard to the peace you desire. In modern war, victory should include winning the war as well as winning the peace. The remainder of this article explores what this might look like in the context of Ukraine and its current and likely long-term struggle against Russia. It is important to normalize a discussion of a Ukrainian victory over Russia. Russia must be defeated and know it has been beaten. Western assistance should be designed to bring this about. The Ukrainian president speaks of victory, and often in his speeches. It is a unifying idea behind Ukrainian strategy, and it ensures that Ukrainian citizens and their soldiers have a sense of purpose for fighting and supporting the ongoing efforts to resist the Russian invasion. This is massively important. I've talked about this heaps before, but I will repeat myself. The Russian soldiers, and this is demonstrably so, as according to people on the front, including Igor Gherkin, when he went down to the front line, he came back, and one of the first things he wrote is, these guys don't have a clue what they're doing. They don't know what their objective is. And he keeps writing about this, and other people have observed this as well. The Russian soldiers don't really know what they're doing on the front line because they don't have a sense of what their objectives are. And in fact, as Russia got stuck in this war when it started out as a special military operation to dethrone Zelensky, possibly assassinate him or make him run away, exchange the government, turn it into a Russian puppet government. But that didn't happen because the Ukrainians put up all this resistance that they weren't expecting. They were suddenly stuck in Ukraine with a whole bunch of military personnel and equipment, but it was kind of arguably the wrong people and the wrong equipment. They had loads of Rosgvardia, the kind of riot police there. They had loads of poorly planned for equipment, and then suddenly they're in a war that they hadn't planned for. So the strategy was all wrong. Everything was all wrong, and accidentally being caught in a war has meant that they were on the back foot from there, and they didn't have a clear objective. There's no plan B. So then Putin had to go, well, and this wasn't really communicated either. You didn't really say what the objectives were. You just started seeing them attack Kyiv, and then that failed. And then they're like, oh my goodness, okay, we'll take the Donbass, and then that failed. Okay, we're going to take less of the Donbass, and when that failed, and now it's just like Bakhmut. You had these changing of objectives, and at one point Putin came out and said there are 4 things we're after: denazification, protecting the Donbass, so on and so forth. And all those 4 things he said, he's failed at all of them, like 100%. So he actually set them out in very clearly in words, and he failed at them. And no one really knows what the actual objectives are presently for Putin. And I think that's partly because he can't have an objective that he can win at. And again, I said this in my April 2022 article, that there is no way Putin can win. Like, since he's now stuck in a country that he now realizes that doesn't want him there, he can't occupy that country. He can't change the government over now. So the objective was exchange the government to a Russian puppet government. Okay, brilliant. Right, that failed, and you can't do that now. So what is your objective? You can't occupy that country of 44 million people of that size. You would need gazillions of people to do that. You ain't got that. You aren't going to be able to do that. So what is your objective? He can't even generate an objective, because there is no winnable objective unless it's like, stay where we are right now. That's maybe doable, but defend our lines that we've got. Yeah. So anyway, that's so important. But the Ukrainians are always talking about victory, and their victory is quite clear. Russians out of 1991 territories. Really clear. That's our victory, and that's what we're going for. And so there's a really big asymmetry between these two sides. While Zelensky has described his 10 principles of war termination and victory are not the same. Victory is a larger concept that looks beyond military success to ensure that the cost of such success is balanced by the improvements in the nation's prospects and future prosperity that were underpinned by the costs of war. What might this look like for Ukraine? Well, this is where the international community play a massive part. I propose 7 components. 1, defeat Russia in Ukraine. 2, security guarantees for the future of Ukraine. 3, economic prosperity. 4, reconstruction. 5, social reintegration. 6, justice. And finally 7, Russia eschews its imperial strategic culture. Many of these elements also comprise part of Ukraine's future deterrent against Russian aggression. After all, even after Ukraine wins this war, it will still have a lengthy land border with Russia. It will take some time some time before Ukraine and its partners in the West can reduce the sources of conflict with Russia. This essentially requires Russia to shun its imperial ambitions and could be a very long-term undertaking. Yeah, there's a cultural shift that needs to take place. There's a political shift that needs to take place. You would need a different kind of government, different kind of regime. It's a huge undertaking for Russia to be the sort of nation that doesn't pose that continued existential threat to Ukraine. Therefore, while that is in progress, the Ukrainians and their partners will need to work on the other 6 components of victory. 1, defeat Russian forces in Ukraine. There is no prospect for long-term stability if Russia retains illegally seized territories. Victory requires the Ukrainians must continue to push all Russian forces from its territory. This requires ongoing support. 2, security guarantees. Once Russia has been ejected from Ukraine, Ukraine must be in a position to keep them out. Therefore, Ukraine will require a strong military in the wake of the war, as well as security guarantees of future assistance, including NATO membership. I think lots of that is in place, and people are promising equipment that is a long-term project. So even when you talk about fighter jets, it may be that that's happening, but it's probably a couple of years before they can realistically be delivered and used in any meaningful way. And there's talk about tanks still to be delivered way into 2024, so on and so forth. So I think there is a lot of thought in terms of a long-term chronology. economic assistance and prosperity. Throughout the war, Ukraine has received economic assistance to allow it to pay salaries and keep the government solvent as Russia seeks to strangle the Ukrainian economy. Such assistance is likely to be required for some time to come. For reconstruction, the physical reconstruction of Ukraine will be a significant undertaking. In March 2023, the World Bank updated its estimates at the cost of recovery and reconstruction for Ukraine with a figure of 411 billion US dollars. I mean, there's lots to think about there. In fact, a commenter on my threads today said, this is Frank van der Stam, says, "Hi team, sorry I don't go to the comments very often, so I might be stating the blatantly obvious. Having China coming for a visit for possible peace proposals a mere day after Scholz was talking about peace with the different democratic Russia post-war shows how frantically the world is maneuvering the war to take maximum benefit from the time after the war. Currently, Russia has become practically a vassal state for China. I think Stoltenberg used the term, and many people have used this term. With Russia isolated from the free world, China is enjoying the presence of a weakened partner who sells them resources at bottom prices. I've talked previously how I think China gains from Russia losing. Yeah, Russia and China are supposed to be ideological partners, but I think China is far more practical than that. They don't really care for Russia, only in what Russia offers in terms of utility for China. So if Russia lose, China get to help themselves to hydrocarbons, get to maybe help themselves to some of the eastern provinces in the name of helping Russia get back on its feet. China are going to be in there, sticking their fingers in all the pies and all the um, oil wells. So I think there is a case for China not minding if Russia loses, but also if Russia wins, China still gain as well. So I think whatever happens, China are in a win-win situation. Um, China is happy as Larry, says this commenter again, where things are, whereas a democratic Russia with Putin removed would mean the end of the party for them. I still think they'd have a massive hand in kind of reconstruction of Russia. I think Russia might still end up, even a democratic Russia, would still end up being heavily influenced by China, or China will have influence. They will have their part to play in that future Russia. The West, on the other hand, wants a new Russia that slowly comes back into the fold, a Russia they can trade with and doesn't stick with the anti-Western doctrine. To achieve this change in Russia has to come from the inside. The people in Moscow and St. Petersburg have been very much sheltered from the many failures in Ukraine, but even state TV had clips that showed little mood swings against the war. If the Russians get constantly shown what a fool Putin was and how detrimental he is for their lives, political change will be inevitable. The currently estimated 15% of Russians who are dead set against the war would eventually become the majority. So I suspect the West is pursuing a tactic of a slow, exhausting war, training programs, equipment pledges that are all planned well into the next year to allow time for a change in political opinion, or better said, development of political opinion, which is something Putin meticulously suppressed ever since he came to power, to facilitate a path to the new Russia Scholz envisaged yesterday. Just lastly, to support my thoughts, the Western politicians seem to avoid language like we are going to beat Russia, but rather put it like Russia must not win. This is really interesting. This is what Biden is careful with as well. Some people say, "Oh, Biden's never said he wants Ukraine to win." Doesn't talk about, but actually, I think this is just careful statesmanship. You got to be careful how you state these things. Like, people don't talk about regime change because that's like a big no-no as a statement, as a phrase. But everyone wants regime change. Of course they do in the West and the allies of Ukraine. But it's language is super important, because if the other side get hold of that and manipulate that language against you, it can be counterproductive. So Biden is very careful. It's not to say he's pro-Russian at all. He's just being a proper statesman and thinking carefully about what he says. Um, and his advisors will be well onto that. So rather put it like Russia must not win, Macron's words yesterday. The West clearly doesn't want to alienate the Russian people from the West. So I bet China is putting a little pressure on Ukraine to accept a peace that Putin can live with. Would have loved to be a fly on the wall in that meeting. So this was in answer to the meeting between the Chinese and the Ukrainians yesterday, which is, a significant event. So just to go back to the idea of reconstructing, there are lots of countries who are going to be involved in that. And of course, China are going to be hanging around the edges for sure as well. Agriculture, commerce, transport, as well as public housing, education, health, and culture have all been impacted by the war. A key need is a reconstruction of society, communities, and the basics of life for Ukraine's citizens. This includes removing unexploded ordnance. Social reintegration, war. So number 5, social reintegration. War causes schisms in society. Hundreds of thousands of demobilized soldiers will return to civil society. There will also be the challenge of psychological damage many returning veterans and civilians must deal with for the remainder of their lives. Returning refugees must also be reintegrated into a society that has been indelibly changed by war since the departure of the beginning of the war. Finally, the Ukrainian government and broader society must decide how to deal with those who collaborated with the Russians. Just going back to demining, the Halo organization, they were featured on Ukraine, the latest podcast yesterday. They're talking about how this war is different because normally you go and do demining projects and exercises well after war's finished. Cambodia is still going on, Angola, places in South America, the Balkans, so on and so forth, long after this has taken place. But actually, the demining is going on as the war is taking place right now in Ukraine. There's so many areas well behind the front lines that are being demined, up near Kharkiv, up near, in the Sumy area and Kyiv as well. And as soon as he was talking, the guy that runs the Halo organization is this massive demining organization. They are planning on getting another. I think they've got 700 at the moment. People doing that job. They're hoping to have 1,200 soon. And as soon as areas are liberated, they go in there. They seek to go in there where it's safe and start doing that work immediately. So it's about trying to expedite this process from a war-torn country to a post-war country and a country where reconstruction is taking place. And if you can start doing some of that, like right now while the war is taking place, then that will be for the benefit of Ukraine. Number 6, justice. Russia has overseen wide-ranging and systemic war crimes and abuses of human rights since the beginning of its invasion. Accountability be re-established for those responsible for such abuses in Ukraine. Embracing victory as a construct that incorporates winning the war and winning the peace provides for a pragmatic and durable strategy for Ukrainian victory. You can read more detailed examination of this in his latest Futura Doctrina post. That's on Substack. As vital as the coming Ukrainian offensives are, we must also keep an eye on the context against which military activities are conducted. Military operations serve a larger political purpose for Ukraine. The highest political purpose can only be a just and durable victory. So hopefully that made some sense to you. I was going to do a Chris O wiki thread, but I think I might have run out of time for that because that's a pretty long one. So I'm just going to leave you talking about demining. I suppose this is a perfect way to end today's extra. As far as demining is concerned, right, this seems like bonkers. But evidently, it's not that bonkers because they keep doing it, and this guy hasn't had his face blown off. But I just wouldn't do this with just wearing a cap. I'd be like, motorbike helmet, they're the bare minimum. Like, I'm not, I'm no pretty picture myself, but I still wouldn't want shrapnel flying in my face. Well, I suppose you could say it'd improve it. But this is how to demine. I mean, that's just nuts. He's just got a massive piece of wood. And he's smacking a mine. All those splinters flying off right in your eye. So what are you doing? But, dirty job. Someone's got to do it, I guess. It's just a very different way of demining. I don't think the Halo organization advocates for this. I don't think they give their volunteers or the people doing their work say, right, here's your equipment, a cap and a massive plank. Right, go out and smack as many mines as you can get your hands on. Or don't put your hands on it, just whack the bit of wood on it. Good luck, and tally them all up, and we'll see you at 5 o'clock. Lunch breaks at 12. Okay. How many bits of wood do I get? Just the one. So it might get a little bit shorter. Towards the end of your shift, good luck. Yeah, anyway. I don't mean to laugh about make jokes about mine. These are super serious things, but yeah, just rather that wasn't my job. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. I appreciate your support, and much more to come over the next few days as I still have stacks of content to get through as ever. Thank you so much to the people who support the channel through Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal and all that kind of stuff, and YouTube. Thanks, and of course my members who are legends, one and all. You are brilliant. Thank you. Take care. Speak soon.